Professor Ferguson, for being with us today. It's an honor. We're delighted to have you here in our on and off talks in Líbero. So let me start right away with a question about Chile. Since you have been to our country many times, during one of these times, I think it was in 2014, you said that Chile was beginning to exercise its right to be stupid, because you were talking about the trend that was starting that moment in Chile towards income distribution and not to wealth creation. How do you see Chile now from abroad? What's your impression on Chile now?
Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to this Zoominar. And Juan Ignacio, it's good to see you. I'll remind people what I meant when I used the phrase right to be stupid first. The phrase was used by John Kerry when he was Secretary of State, and he was explaining to a German audience some of the peculiarities of American politics. And making a joke, as he thought, he said that Americans had a right to be stupid, which they were fond of exercising. Of course, being Germans, the audience didn't laugh and wrote down very earnestly das Dummheitsrecht, which I presume is how you translate it into German. When I was last in Chile, the debate was underway on the constitution and whether it needed to be replaced. There was also a pretty spirited debate about economic policy, with an obvious revival of socialist or social democratic ideas. And so I think I pointed out that this might be Chile's version of the right to be stupid. The historical evidence is that changing constitutions does not make countries more prosperous. If it did, Venezuela would be one of the richest countries in the world, because I think it's changed its constitution more than any other country. In fact, Latin American countries over the past century and a half have been responsible for more constitutional changes than any other region of the world. And I think it's pretty clear that that's not really a good strategy. Whereas in the United States, the striking feature is constitutional continuity, amendments, but not a new constitution every 30 years or so. In Britain, where I originate, the constitutional continuities are perhaps even more striking. And if you hadn't remembered that, the funeral following the death of Queen Elizabeth II would have reminded you. So, of course, it's been a while since I've been in Santiago because of the pandemic and the difficulties of travel, and I'm afraid of being out of touch. I always hate professors from the United States who go around pontificating about the rest of the world on the basis of relatively little knowledge, so I'm not going to do that. But I will say that I was relieved that the Constitution, the revised Constitution or the new Constitution, was voted down in the recent referendum, because it was pretty clear to me that that document was a dog's breakfast that would have worked quite badly for Chile. And I incline to the view that it would be preferable to seek constitutional continuity in Chile and to build on what has worked quite well, even if one has some doubts or qualms about the Constitution's origins. We could all say that the origins of the British Constitution are somewhat dated. After all, it can be traced back to the 17th century and even further back than that. But just because something started in the distant past before democracy doesn't make it bad. And I think the same applies to Chile.
Let me broaden the scope of the question then. Let's talk about Latin America, because what we have seen in Latin America in recent years, and Chile is part of that also, that there's a sort of a leftist wave running through Latin America. We have a left this government in Colombia, in Peru, in Chile, in probably in Brazil, in Mexico, of course, in Argentina as well. And all of them have this similar trend, similar position vis-a-vis, for example, the Washington Consensus or neoliberalism, as it is called. How do you view Latin America as a whole? Not from any particular country, but in a wide and ample trend.
I think it's worth noting that globally, there is no Washington Consensus anymore. And so it's important not to use a yardstick that's outdated. Think of the ways in which the United States and other advanced economies have thrown fiscal and monetary caution to the winds in recent years, first in response to the financial crisis, then in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Think of the way in which, under Donald Trump, the United States walked away from free trade, imposed tariffs on imports from China and elsewhere, tariffs that haven't been repealed by the Biden administration. So the Washington Consensus, which was essentially a set of rules about trade policy, it should be liberal, about fiscal policy, it should be balanced, about monetary policy, it should aim at low inflation. All of this seems to me to lie, if not in the trash can of history, it's in a drawer somewhere in everybody's office that doesn't get opened very often.
But still, it's very much mentioned by these leaders from those countries that I mentioned.
Well, judge leaders by their actions and not by their words is a pretty good rule that I try to follow. And if one looks at the actions of the US, or for that matter, the UK government in recent years, the first thing that strikes one is the wild fiscal incontinence, the extraordinary readiness to run deficits by conservative and liberal or social democratic governments alike. You would look in vain for signs of the Washington Consensus in anything that's actually happened in Washington over the last decade and a half. Having said all that, it's pretty clear that wherever socialist policies are tried again, things don't end well. And you'd have thought that in Latin America, the advertisements for leftist policies in Venezuela and for Peronist policies in Argentina would be like those health warnings about tobacco use that you sometimes still see, warning smoking can kill, and warning socialism can destroy your economy. Unfortunately, for reasons that we can go into, not that much attention seems to be paid by the rest of Latin America to what exactly happened in Venezuela and what has also gone wrong in its different way in Argentina. And so what we see, as you correctly observe, is a general trend towards the left. It'd be amazing to me if Bolsonaro survived the approaching Brazilian election. Almost all the polls point to Lula returning to power. And I could go on, and I don't need to, listing all the ways in which Latin American politics has moved to the left in recent years. Interestingly, I don't think it's a global trend. In fact, if there's a global trend, it's probably for politics to continue in the populist right-wing direction. Think of what just happened in Italy, where a right-wing coalition is almost certainly going to be formed, led by Giorgia Meloni of the Fratelli d'Italia. In Sweden, you've seen a swing to the right. Broadly speaking, the trends in both policy and politics in the Northern Hemisphere seem to me to be going in the other direction. That's not because the Washington Consensus is more popular there. It's more that the right has reshaped itself into something that is more concerned with cultural issues than with economic policies. And I think if one looks at the United States, it's pretty likely that the Republicans will win the midterms, regaining at least the House of Representatives. And it's really quite likely that the Republican candidate will win the 2024 election. That's what the prediction markets are saying. It's not clear whether that's going to be Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis or someone else who hasn't yet really surfaced. But I can't really see how Joe Biden gets a second term or Kamala Harris gets elected president, and I certainly struggle to see any other candidate doing that. So the world, if I had to generalize wildly, is shifting to the right, at least the democratic world, because there's a kind of viable populist set of policies that are focused on cultural issues, and that focus on the cultural attracts a significant proportion of voters from the working class. And the big problem that social democrats have in most of the world is that their ideas are actually quite unpopular with the working class. The more woke you are as a progressive, the more you believe in gender fluidity, the more that you believe in intersectionality, the more that you think that everything is white supremacy, the more likely you are to alienate working class voters and make it easy for the populists on the right. So I think Latin America is unusual. Bolsonaro seems to have failed to make that work as an enduring political strategy. I think more due to ineptitude than to the strategy being fatally flawed. And I think the interesting thing to ask is, will the left blow it in Latin America in the same way that the left has blown it elsewhere? And is it just a matter of time before Latin American conservatives figure out how to play the culture war to their own political advantage?
Let me turn to the world as a whole. In one of your books, I can't remember which one actually, you write that that crisis developed from quite a long period, but collapse and unravels very fast. And when we look at the world today, we see crises everywhere. Some very much unexpected, for example, the pandemics, but we see war, which hadn't been the case for 30 or more years. We see an increasing rivalry between the US and China, high inflation and low economic growth, political polarization, authoritarianism. What is happening and where are we headed to, if you can predict that?
Well, in my most recent book, Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe, I tried to offer, not for the first time, because I've written about this before, as you say, a view of the historical process that warns against the idea of predictable cycles of history. I think it's important to recognize that history isn't a set of straight lines or regular curves. And I think we have an instinctive preference for straight lines and regular curves because they're easier to predict. And history just isn't like that. And the reason it's not like that is that even if there are cycles in, say, economic life, and clearly business cycles have some reality, disasters of all shapes and sizes keep coming along and they don't follow any predictable distribution. There is no way of predicting the next world war. There is no way of predicting the next pandemic. There is no way of predicting the next massive volcanic eruption that will in fact alter the Earth's climate for a time. All of these things are not normally distributed. We can't therefore attach probabilities to them. We just know that they can happen. And that's because they're either random, I think that's true of the incidence of war, or they follow power laws, which tends to be true of geological events like volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. For that reason, if you just think of history as one damn disaster after another, it's very difficult to make any kind of statement about the future because you're probably going to be doing that dreadful thing that social scientists do, which is just to project forward a trend line that you've extrapolated from the recent past. So historians are here to say, don't do that. I'll give you an example. In the seminal textbook that economics students nearly always used to look at, Paul Samuelson's Economics, there was a chart that appeared from 1961 right the way through to the 1980s that projected that Soviet gross national product would overtake US gross national product at some point in the reasonably near future. It was supposed to happen in the mid-1980s. In the 1961 edition, by the late 1980s, the date of the Soviet takeover had been moved to 2011. But those trends were nonsense. There was no such trend. It was imaginary. It was based on a misreading of Soviet economic performance, but it was also based on a misunderstanding of the nature of the planned economy, which was that while it might generate rapid growth in the post-war period, at some point, the inherent pathologies of a planned economy would cause productivity to collapse and value subtraction to take over from value creation. As we all know, the Soviet economy collapsed in the 1980s. It never even got to be 45% the size of the US economy. And so Samuelson's mistake, a very influential mistake, reminds us that the historical process doesn't tend to follow such trend lines. And many trend lines that intellectuals believe that they discern are, in fact, illusions. My old friend Steve Pinker loves trend lines. In his book Enlightenment Now, he has a whole lot of trend lines telling you how much the world is getting better. But in that book, Steve also wrote that he didn't think there would be another pandemic because we had solved the problem that gave rise to pandemics. The book was published just a few years before the COVID-19 pandemic struck. And there's no line that tells you there's going to be a pandemic beginning in late 2019. That's just the way the world works. A new zoonotic virus made the leap, either because of an experiment or naturally, to humans, and spread around the world with staggering speed. Anything I say about the future, therefore, is hedged with the observation that I can't tell you what the next disaster will be. When I was finishing Doom, which was 2 years ago now, I said that it was quite likely that there would be a geopolitical shock next, but I thought it would be involving China. And I missed the fact that it would in fact be a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Even a year ago, if we'd had this conversation, we'd probably have talked more about Afghanistan than Ukraine. And a year from now, I'll be bound to predict that Ukraine will have been displaced by some other event that we didn't see coming today. I'm not going to tell you that nothing can be predicted, because that would be a counsel of despair. I'm just going to tell you that in historical pattern recognition, you're not looking for straight lines and you're not looking for predictable waves. What you're trying to figure out is where the next shock will come from, the shock that it's hard to imagine today. And I'll give you a few examples. I think that Russia is losing the war in Ukraine, that the Ukrainian people, led by Volodymyr Zelensky, have exposed the deep, deep dysfunction of Putin's empire. I think the Iranian regime is teetering on the brink of collapse in the face of mass protest. And I also think that the Chinese Communist Party is heading towards a moment of reckoning because its economic model is broken. The three biggest challenges or threats to democracy are, in fact, all in varying states of crisis. And the thing that will probably surprise most of us in the next 10 years is that 1, 2, or 3 of those regimes will fall. And when it happens, with amazing speed, intellectuals will pretend that they predicted it. But I'm predicting it now, on the record. I think that it's highly likely that 10 years from now, the Chinese Communist Party will no longer control China, Vladimir Putin will no longer rule Russia, and the Iranian theocracy will no longer run Iran. Because these are regimes nearing the end of their shelf life, in my view. And one must try to take a little risk in making predictions, and I've just done that. But if one doesn't take that risk, then I don't think one's really adding anything as an historian.
What happened with, I had that question scheduled for later in the interview, but let's deal with it right away. What happened with authoritarianism? If you look back for 5 years, it looked like they were very strong and they were ruling the day almost. And democracy was of course, it is still, I believe, in crisis, but everybody was betting on China, even on Russia, because of the strength and their capability to get things done. What's going on that these regimes have begun to show the signs of collapse that you mentioned?
Well, each, of course, is authoritarian in its own way. The Chinese system is still the heir of the Marxist-Leninist one-party state. Putin's Russia is a kind of attempt to revive the traditions of the pre-1917 Russian Empire, though in practice it's more like a fascist regime. And Iran's theocracy is a novelty, really. One of the few attempts to base an entire system of government on Sharia law that there has been in modern times. The problem with all of these systems is pretty obvious. They don't have the kind of incentive structures of a free society. And the incentive structures of a free society aren't perfect, and they incentivize us to do stupid things, as we've already discussed. But broadly speaking, they do incentivize entrepreneurs to exploit technological and other opportunities to profit maximize. And they allow us as citizens to express our dissatisfaction with the ways in which we're governed. And the accountability that's an inbuilt feature of democracy is ultimately a superpower. It allows democracies to self-repair and change direction. And we're always complaining about how that works in practice, but we should never forget that having unaccountable party government above the law of the sort that they have in China is much, much worse. And it's worse because a relatively small number of people, one really in the case of Xi Jinping, can make huge blunders that go uncorrected. The Chinese zero COVID policy was widely hailed as the best possible policy in 2020, so much so that Britain, America, and other Western countries tried to copy it. The other Niall Ferguson, the epidemiologist at Imperial College London, explicitly said his role model was China. Now, at the time, I said this was a bad idea, that we weren't even capable of doing lockdowns like the Chinese, and that in any case, lockdowns were a very expensive and blunt instrument for dealing with a disease like COVID. I also pointed out that it was highly unlikely that China would develop good vaccines because they've never been good at vaccines at any point in modern history. So for me, it seemed highly unlikely that China would somehow win the pandemic. And in the book Doom, written 2 years ago, I think I rightly said, it just looks like China's getting this right, but it's actually getting it wrong. And now we see that China's trapped with a policy that essentially stifles economic activity, but can't be removed because the population really isn't protected against COVID by the inferior Chinese vaccines. And that's a good illustration of how an unaccountable authoritarian regime can make a really big mistake, and it can't be corrected once it's been made. We corrected our course in the United States in 2020 because Donald Trump wasn't re-elected. I think we slightly overestimated the benefits of having Joe Biden instead. And I think we pretty seriously underestimated what the Trump administration had got right, because after all, Operation Warp Speed was the single most important policy response to the pandemic, and it delivered high efficacy vaccines very fast indeed. All of that tends to be forgotten now. But it's this possibility of course correction that's really crucial, I think. We shouldn't therefore be surprised that China is stumbling. It's just that we were taken in by the smoke and mirrors of visits to Shanghai and Beijing and a pretty effective propaganda message that told us China was the country of the future. It was just the same as the propaganda message of the Soviet Union in the 1930s, and many people were taken in by that. to see the reality of China, you had to travel outside the major cities to see the realities of the countryside and of the second and third tier cities. I never thought that China would overtake the United States. And I, in fact, made a bet several years ago with Justin Yifu Lin, a Chinese economist, that China's gross domestic product will never equal that of the United States in current dollar terms. So I think I've been reasonably consistent about this. And I've been consistent because I've learned the lessons of the 20th century. And the lessons of the 20th century are that authoritarian systems produce inferior outcomes to free and democratic systems.
Let me remind our viewers that you can post your questions on the chat session. Pueden hacer sus preguntas a través del chat. Si es que quieren hacer alguna pregunta al profesor Ferguson, lo haremos más adelante en la conversación.
Juan Ignacio, can I ask, will you choose questions from the chat or should I?
If you want to, you can choose.
That requires me to do two things at one time, which is quite challenging for me, but I'll take a look.
You can view the questions. There are already some of them. Can you look at them?
Yes, I can see them, and I could even answer a few of them quickly, because some of them, it seems to me, are relatively straightforward. I think the United States made a mistake pulling out of TPP, to address the question near the top from Sebastian of Pupin. And I think it's good that it's still alive without the United States. And I think at some point, a rational American government will join. Do I think Putin is bluffing on his nuclear threat? Chaim Yankelevich asks, yes, I don't think he's bluffing, but I do think we're deterring him. He is, I think, not going to be able to use a nuclear weapon because the costs to Russia of doing so would be absolutely catastrophic. Even although the US response would not be nuclear, it would be a conventional type response, but it would be on a very large scale. And I'll take one more. You ask Eduardo Escafi, do I think Americans are going to isolate more and leave the global police role because of the fracking revolution and the Abraham Accord? Well, not really. First of all, the fracking revolution and the Abraham Accord are somewhat undervalued by the Biden administration. And so in some ways, the US is not exploiting its natural gas and oil capabilities the way it would be if Trump had been re-elected. And of course, the Biden administration sort of ignores the Abraham Accords and tries to resuscitate the Iran nuclear deal. I don't think the trend for the US is towards isolationism either way. Although Trump talked a somewhat isolationist talk, in practice, the US continued to be the dominant power and a major leader of alliances under Trump. And that hasn't really changed under Biden. Even if a president wants to be isolationist, and Trump had that instinct, he can't, in fact, extricate the US from all its overseas commitments. They're just too sticky. And so if Trump couldn't do it, I don't think anyone's going to. And if Trump's re-elected, he may try again, but I think it'll be impossible. And that's because the costs of retreat are much higher than people understand. And once you start looking at what happens when you pull out, you realize that it's really a very expensive thing to do. Pulling out of Afghanistan was disastrous for Joe Biden's polling numbers, as well as for America's reputation in the world. And that's just an example of why isolationism isn't really a viable option in the 21st century.
Neil, we're approaching the end of our time. I want to honor our half an hour commitment with you. But first of all, let me ask you, you being a British subject, I cannot resist to ask you about the passing of Queen Elizabeth. And it strikes me, why does a modern society, almost a paradigmatic modern society as the British, show such a profound attachment and even endearment, I would say, to the monarchy, which is one of the foremost symbols of the old regime? why does it happen in a modern society that people acts like we have seen that the British people acted?
Well, the idea of a constitutional monarchy, that is to say, a monarchy constrained by representative institutions, was once a very modern idea. And it can be said to have originated in 17th century England and to have been consolidated in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Queen was in many ways the personification of a tradition of constitutional monarchy going back to the Glorious Revolution. I think the reason that the monarchy remains popular is fairly obvious. The Queen did a most extraordinary job of not only personifying the continuities of British history, but also managing the end of empire, which was no easy thing when you consider the state that Britain was in when she became Queen 70 years ago. The Queen's 70-year reign, I think, was a triumph of that system whereby politics occupies the Parliament, the House of Commons, but a substantial part of the institutional prestige of government lies outside that realm of politics. Americans and others who live in republics looked enviously at the national unity that we saw at the time of the Queen's death and the subsequent mourning and funeral, because they realized that in Britain, not everything is political, that the identity of Britain, the nature of the state that we call the United Kingdom, is not something that is entirely subject to partisan politicization. Whereas here in the United States, and indeed it's true in most republics, everything is political, including sovereignty itself. I'm a monarchist. I think constitutional monarchy is actually a superior system to republican government, because throughout history, you can see republics are prone to decay, to crisis, when a populist or demagogic president says, the elites are corrupt, the constitution's a sham, you, the people, deserve better. And that's a very dangerous message. And republics throughout history have succumbed to it, going all the way back to the age of Rome. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the power that comes with constitutional monarchy, precisely because it takes some part of the identity of the state out of the realm of partisan politics.
Thank you very much, Professor Ferguson. You've been most kind. I want to honor our commitment, as I said, of distracting you only for half an hour. So let me thank you in the name of our viewers, and I hope we will have the chance to chat again in probably in direct, not only through the seminar, as you mentioned.
I look forward to returning to Chile soon. I have very fond memories of my time there. I'm also working on Chilean history as part of my work on the biography of Henry Kissinger, controversial subject, as you well imagine. I'd like to thank everybody for their questions. I'm sorry I only got to a minority of the ones in the chat. I wish you all a very, very enjoyable Tuesday afternoon and evening, and thank you for a very enjoyable discussion.
Thank you very much.
El Líbero, la realidad como no la habías visto. Haz que estos contenidos lleguen más lejos haciéndote miembro de la red Líbero.